And so it's about how do you live a good life? And that's the entire premise of our show. The tagline is, conversations about creating a life worth living. That's what we do. And so I'm deeply immersed in that every day. And that's a definite support to me being in recovery for sure.
It's time for the Share Recovery Podcast, where we bring you amazing life-changing success stories from addicts and alcoholics all over the world who share their inspiring journey in recovery. And now, here's your host,
On today's episode of the Share Podcast, our featured guest is Eric Zimmer, the host and the founder of the hit podcast, The One You Feed, based on the parable about the battle between two wolves, a good wolf and a bad wolf, inside all of us. It's a podcast featuring conversations about creating a life worth living. However, prior to launching this podcast, Eric battled drugs and alcohol for many years. He started his drinking career getting drunk on mouthwash as a teenager, and though he did not like the taste of alcohol, he did love the effects. Shortly thereafter, Eric begins experimenting with heroin and quickly evolves into a full-blown drug addict living in the streets. To support his drug habit, Eric resorts to stealing checkbooks and credit cards out of cars and soon had outstanding warrants for forgery and grand theft. Due to the severe consequences of his addiction and criminal behavior, Eric seeks recovery and manages to stay clean and sober for 8 years. When his wife cheats on him with a friend who is also in recovery, Eric develops a resentment with recovery and relapses. Over the next few years, Eric hits even harder rock bottoms and ultimately is forced to seek recovery again. Today, Eric has over 8 years clean and has found his purpose in life through his podcast. Join us now as Eric takes us through 20 years of drug addiction, alcoholism, relapse, and his amazing journey into recovery. And after this interview, if you enjoyed listening to the Share Podcast, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or Stitcher Radio. This will ensure we get ranked well on these networks, and that means more people will easily find the Share Podcast. This is the best way to show your support and help us grow. And finally, if you would like to make a donation to the Share Podcast, you can do so using PayPal. The entire amount of your donation will go towards maintaining and growing the show. On the top right corner of the website, you'll see a donate button. Just click on it, and this will take you to the page where you can make your donation. Thanks again for helping the Share Podcast become a huge success. Now back to the show. Hey, Eric, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you on the show today. How you feeling?
I am doing pretty good. As I mentioned to you in our comments before, I'm dragging a little bit this morning, but all in all, I'm doing great.
All right. Well, we'll power through this, Eric. All right.
Yes.
So let's dive right in. Folks, today we have a very special guest, Eric Zimmer, and he is the host of The One You Feed. It's a very popular podcast. It's been growing exponentially, and it's got a similar theme to the Share Podcast. So we're bringing him on the show today so he can tell us his amazing story of recovery. So Eric, tell us a little bit about how your life is today, how you balance your routine, and tell us a little bit about your show.
Yeah, so my life today, it's a great life. It's very, very full, which I try not to complain about. Every once in a while I find myself complaining and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm choosing this. And all the things that are in my life are, all the things that are in my life are great. So my life is really good. My routine is I don't have as much routine as I would like, particularly with the travel schedule I've been keeping lately. So every day looks a little bit different, but it usually has some form of working on the show, working on the podcast, doing some other consulting work that I do, and then recovery-related events, which are for me are a little bit more like internal. How am I taking care of myself inside myself? That's kind of the basics. I mean, it's hard to say exactly what one day looks like. I wish they were a little bit more standard right now.
So Eric, tell me then, what is it that you do to maintain your spiritual condition?
Yeah, and I think that's the key for me is, it talks about as long as we're in fit spiritual condition, right? Alcohol or drugs are not a problem for us. And so the show that I do is my primary way of staying in fit spiritual condition. And that's why I started it, really was. I figured that if I'm interviewing somebody, the show's about feeding your good wolf. It's about making the right choices. And so I figured if I'm interviewing somebody every week for that, then I'm reading their book or their material to get ready for that. So I'm kind of immersed in that. And then I've got the community that's grown up around the show of people that I'm talking to and working with. So those are really the ways that I feed my good wolf, the way I keep in fit spiritual condition. Also, I meditate every day. That's a big piece for me. Is I'm a daily meditator, which I've been doing pretty much every day for the last several years. So those are the main components of it for me.
Now, your show, The One You Feed, is based on a parable. Tell us what that parable is.
Yep. It goes sort of like this. There's a grandparent who's talking with his grandson, and he says, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One's a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And in the context of the show, I'd say addiction. And the grandson stops and he thinks about it for a second. And he looks up at his grandfather and he says, well, grandfather, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed.
Absolutely.
And I got that parable. I mean, I heard that parable the first time in recovery. And I think for anybody in recovery, you hear that and it's just an instant like, whoa, like you get it instantly. Oh, yeah, that is kind of what this whole thing is about.
I was just about to say that. That's where I first heard that parable. Because I'm in the podcast community, I had seen The One You Feed come up. And I thought, wow, what a cool name. And as soon as I went into it, I realized it was based on the parable, which is exactly what I learned when I first came in. And it was more based on the addiction factor.
Right.
You know, what are you going to feed? Which wolf are you going to feed? Are you going to feed the recovery wolf? Or are you going to feed the addiction wolf? Because either way, you're feeding one. They don't both starve and they don't both get fed.
Yep. And I think particularly I would say this goes for everybody given the culture and the world we live in. But if you're kind of on autopilot, particularly if you're an addict, you're going to feed that addiction wolf.
No question about it.
It takes a conscious effort to feed the good wolf, which is why recovery is as action focused in my mind as it is. It's about taking the actions to feed that good wolf or to strengthen our recovery.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing right now with our podcast. I heard a few of your episodes, and it was very recovery focused, discussing all the typical topics that we do discuss, which is our own insecurities and our own ways of dealing with those around us, because there's a huge factor in almost a serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and the courage to change the things that I can. And the things that I can change is me. I can change myself and hopefully be the change that I want to see in the world. And I think that that's one of the strongest principles that I've been able to pull away from recovery.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the show is not a recovery show. We have a lot of people on who are not in recovery, but the themes are absolutely woven through it. And my perspective of the world has been extremely shaped by my recovery. So, yeah, it's very focused in that way. And I agree. I think the Serenity Prayer is probably the most powerful piece of wisdom I've ever gotten.
Excellent. All right. Well, since we've gotten a good idea of who Eric Zimmer is today and about The One You Feed, let's talk a little bit about the past. So, Eric, how old were you the first time you drank or used drugs? And more importantly, how did they make you feel?
Yeah, I think the first time I was probably 15 years old, and I got drunk on mouthwash, which is an odd way to start.
It is an odd way.
But was not the last time for the mouthwash. I think it made me feel really good. Yeah, it definitely made me, I don't think the switch flipped immediately, but I remember thinking it felt pretty good.
So mouthwash was the first thing you drank. Did you actually drink the mouthwash?
Yeah, oh yeah. It happened. Somebody was like, I heard you can get drunk on mouthwash. And I was like, well, I don't even really know what drunk is, right? I've never been drunk, but I was young and stupid. And I was like, yeah, I'll drink a bottle of mouthwash. And sure enough, it will work.
Oh, wow.
I wouldn't recommend. And then the crazy part is that I went on to do it a bunch more times, except I learned that I don't know why I just didn't try and get alcohol elsewhere. Who knows? Maybe I thought it was funny, but I would start by drinking a bottle of Pepto-Bismol first for my stomach, then drink the mouthwash. Yeah, it was, I did not drink normally from the start. I remember a church trip to Florida where I had the whole group drunk on mouthwash one night and everybody's thrown. It was just a mess.
Oh my God. These are the kind of priceless stories that come with, prior to recovery.
I recommend Scope. Listerine's a hard way to go.
I guess it's a more minty flavor, right?
Right, exactly.
All right, Eric. Well, you're all warmed up, buddy, so I'm going to turn this show over to you. It's time for you to share your story with us. The battle against drugs and alcohol, the wreckage it caused in your life, when you hit rock bottom, and finally your journey into recovery up until today. So Eric, take it away.
Excellent. So as I was saying a little bit earlier, my first drink was mouthwash around the age of 15. And I'd never drank normally from the very beginning. I obviously drinking mouthwash. And I remember I didn't drink a lot in high school. I remember, though, a night going out and getting drunk and waking up in the morning the next day and seeing the bottle of vodka still there and thinking, well, why not pour a glass of orange juice, pour the vodka in, and start drinking again the next morning, which is just not normal sort of early stage drinking. But what happened in high school was that I founded a nonprofit organization that tutored inner city children. And when I started that in my junior year, when I saw what alcohol and drugs was doing to those kids' lives, their families, I'm done. I'm not going to have anything to do with this stuff. So I didn't touch a drop of alcohol or any drug or anything for the next couple years in high school. So I pretty much was completely clean my junior and senior year in high school. And then I went away for the summer after I graduated. I went and spent the summer on an island off the coast of Seattle. And when I came back, my girlfriend was dating my best friend. And I just kind of fell apart a little bit. I didn't have any tools to cope with such a thing. I mean, honestly, I don't think I had a lot of tools to cope with anything, but
right.
Certainly not that. And somebody said, well, one night someone had alcohol and said, here, have some of this. And I just didn't have the energy to say no anymore. And I drank it. And that is when I feel like the switch flipped for me, because I instantly didn't care about them anymore. I instantly thought my life was the place to be. I did not draw a whole lot of sober breaths from there until when I got sober about 6.5 years later. So my drinking was the normal, well, not normal, but
I was about to say.
Yeah, for an addict or alcoholic. I mean, I started drinking all the time. I mean, every night I drank without fail from then on. And then I got introduced to marijuana, and so I would smoke pot all day long and drink at night. And then I remember about 2 years into that, I thought, underneath, there's this feeling like this isn't right. Something's not right here. Because I'm after high school. I'm not starting college because I'm getting messed up every night. So I decided that the thing to do would be to move to San Francisco. I had a friend who moved out there, and I thought, I just need to change a location, the old geographic cure idea.
Of course.
And so I moved out there, and I could summarize my time up there by saying the first night I was there, I came to on a park bench in Berkeley and had no idea where I was. And that's pretty much the next period of time in California, just more of the same, except now I'm somewhere I don't know.
How are you supporting yourself?
Well, I had a variety of on again, off again restaurant jobs, or I worked in a bookstore out there. I was a kleptomaniac, so I stole a lot from everywhere I worked, which would only get worse. And then I eventually left San Francisco because exactly that. I got in trouble for stealing from where I worked, and I was fired, and I just thought this is a good time to get out of this state. So I came home. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and so I came home to Ohio and kind of just picked up where I left off. And I was playing in bands a lot at that point. I play guitar, and I joined this band, and I would go to practice, and I'd think to myself, these people, they're higher than I am. I mean, they're more messed up than I am. Like, what is going on here? Because that's quite a feat. And turned out they were heroin users. And so I basically one night said, hey, can I try some? And I snorted it. And, that very first night, I mean, I don't know if I overdosed, but I certainly went out and they had to revive me. And so that ushered in the heroin addiction years for me, which got pretty bleak in a hurry. I don't think, in my opinion, there's not a lot of difference between alcohol and heroin or cocaine or cough medicine or mouthwash. I won't say my opinion, my experience is those things were all the same to me, right? They were fulfilling a purpose, and that purpose was to feel different than I felt when I wasn't taking them. And so they were the same thing, but one of them is legal, alcohol, and the others are not. And so for me, the consequences with heroin came very quickly and very, very hard because it's so expensive.
Right.
And so, before long, I had a $300 a day habit. I was homeless, living in the back of a van, sleeping on a couch that I'd pulled out in front of a dumpster. I remember one day I went to meet the guy who was buying drugs, and we'd always meet out back at some crappy place. He'd be like, yo, man, that's a fine-looking couch. Why don't you grab that thing? Next thing you know, I've got it in the back of the van. I'm sleeping on it. And and I guess by the time it got to that point, I had tried one more geographic cure to get off heroin. I thought, well, I had a friend who lived in this really small town on the coast of Connecticut. And I thought, there's no way they've got drugs there. So I went there, and I was so far from thinking that abstinence was the answer that all I thought was, if I get off the heroin, I'm fine. So my idea of getting clean was smoking dope and drinking wine all day to get off the heroin, because I thought that was the problem. And so I moved to this small town, and they didn't have heroin, but if you borrowed somebody's car an hour and a half away in New Haven, they did. And that ushered in another period of where I was sort of, in Columbus, I was buying drugs. I would know somebody who would know somebody. But once I went out to the East Coast and New Haven and New London and Boston, I was going into the worst part of town and buying drugs on the street, which was just a completely different environment. The danger, I remember sitting one night, my girlfriend and I, on like the 10th floor of a project in Boston. And the guy's like, yeah, we'll be getting some in a little bit. And, I'm standing there. We're sitting in this house for hours. And there's another guy at the table smoking crack, just glaring at me and taking a knife and pounding it into the table and glaring at me. And I'm just sitting there like, well, okay, I'm going to wait here to get my drugs, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So I tried all that. And then fast forward, I'm living in the back of this van. I'm homeless. I'm working and I'm stealing. And one night I'm at work at the restaurant, and I see the police come in the front door of the restaurant, and they just keep walking towards the kitchen. And by the time they get past the counter, I'm like, well, this is pretty much me. And sure enough, it was me they were after, and took me away out of there in handcuffs. And so now the cops were actually great guys to me. That's a whole nother story given today's political environment. But
I'm just trying to picture the cops coming in to get you.
Oh, yeah.
And just the horror that you must be just experiencing. And what were they coming after you for at that time?
I had been stealing checkbooks and credit cards out of cars, and somehow they had caught me for that. I mean, basically, the charges were forgery and grand theft. And
heavy, man, heavy.
Yeah. And so that moment drove me into treatment. And the reason it drove me into treatment was not that I suddenly wanted to get better. All of a sudden, the place that I had been making all this money, the restaurant was the source of a lot of my income, some of it legal, a lot of it not. And that was gone. And the van that I had been living in was the restaurant owner's old van, and that was gone. And so I suddenly now had nothing at all, no plan, no money. And so I went into detox simply out of, I don't have another plan. I forgot to mention I had done one detox before that also, to little or no avail. I stayed sober 30 days out of that detox, and I always joke because I had a sponsor at that time. And on like my 30th day, I went to a meeting, he gave a lead, and I went out afterwards and got high, and I used to tease him like, that must have been a powerful message you delivered that night.
Oh, oh man.
Obviously, I'm kidding, right? I mean, it has everything to do with me and nothing to do with him, but.
And I'm confident he didn't take it that way either. He would have probably looked at it the same way we would look at somebody that came to us and said the same thing and goes, this poor bastard.
Yeah. I mean, I was teasing him. I was teasing him about it after I got sober again later. So,
okay.
No, not at that time.
Okay.
I was not under the illusion like it was his fault. Later, I just used to tease him. So this drove me into detox. So I went back into detox, and there they said, we think you need to go into our 28-day program. And my immediate reaction was, no way. I can't go into a 28-day program. Now, why I would have thought that, I can't imagine looking back on it now. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a place to live. It was the best option I had been given in a while. But I said, no, that's not the right thing to do. And then I went back to my room, and I had one of those mini moments of clarity. And that moment of clarity was pretty much, I'm going to die if I stay out there. The other thing I forgot to mention, in addition to having about 25 years of potential jail time hanging over my head, I also had been diagnosed now with hepatitis C.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a big person now, right? I'm 5'7", 5'8". I weigh about 150 pounds. At that point, I weighed about 100 pounds. So, I was in bad shape any way you could look at it. And so I had that moment of clarity, which is, I'm going to die if I go back out there. So I said to them, you know what, I'll go into the 28-day treatment program, but I want to go. It was Christmas time. I said, I want to go home, just spend a couple of days with my family, and then I'll come back. And I remember they let me out on Christmas Eve. I got money from my grandparents. And I just still remember this. Talk about like your powerless moment. I still remember Christmas Eve. I get that money. Everybody goes to bed. Suddenly that urge is on me, right? I've been sober maybe 8 or 9 days at that point. I'm completely detoxed. It's not a physical need.
Right.
And so I called the drug dealer, and I remember driving to the drug dealer's house crying because I didn't want to go. There was this huge part of me that didn't want to go because I think I had at that point had gone, all right, I'm going to go into treatment. I had started to see some degree of hope or something. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I couldn't. It felt like the car was driving itself to go buy heroin that night, which I did, and I got high. And next morning, I got up, went right back to the detox center, Christmas Day. So that was my original sobriety date, which we'll get to in a while, Christmas of 94.
Okay.
And so I went into that 28-day treatment program, and life started to change. And after about 28 days, during that period, they asked me if I wanted to go to this long-term treatment place called the House of Hope in Columbus. And I was like, no, I don't, of course. 6 months. And then again, during that period, I revised my opinion. I thought, you know what? I do want to go. Because I started to see that hope. I started to see like, oh, wow, I could have a life. I can get out of this mess I've been in for 7 years. So I wanted to go to this long-term treatment program, and I couldn't get in. They accepted me, but they didn't have a bed ready. So they held me at this other detox center for 28 days, 30 days, 35 days. And finally, about 40 days, they were like, look, we cannot keep you here anymore. You got to go home. So I went home. I didn't want to. I went to my dad's house because I didn't really have a home. I just jumped into AA with both feet. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a license. I hadn't had one in about 7 years. I went to meetings morning, noon, and night. Got up in the morning, got on a bus, took a bus to an early meeting, got out of there, would try and catch a ride or catch another bus to a noon meeting. I'd get a ride to the nighttime meeting. That's all I did for several weeks. And then maybe a month after that, I got a call from this place, the House of Hope, and they said, you got a bed ready. Do you want to come? And I was about probably 2 months sober at that point, going to AA every day. And a lot of people were like, I don't think you really need to go do that. You're doing good. And I thought about it, and I just went, you know what? I'd rather at the end of 6 months go, I'm not sure if I needed that or not, than in 6 months go, oh man, I should have done that.
Right.
So I went to a 6-month recovery program, and it was very kind of they call it the last house on the block. It's not a fancy thing in any way, shape, or form. It's a bunch of guys living in an old house, but it was great for me. It gave me a structure and a discipline that I just didn't have, and was really good for me, kept me very close to recovery for that period of time. So I did that. I got out, and I just threw myself into AA from that point on. I mean, I had commitments. I was chairing meetings. Shortly after I got a car, so I started giving people rides. I was really way into recovery, and that stayed that way for quite some time. So this just goes on for a bunch of years. I get treatment for hepatitis C, which was extraordinarily unpleasant. I was really, really sick, but I did it, and it worked. And so maybe at about 6 years sober, my girlfriend announces that she's pregnant, and we've got a son on the way. So we do the right thing, or what seems like the right thing. We get married, have the kid, and everything is good. I have managed to bumble my way into a career path at this point. I never went to school. My only experience had been working in restaurants or a cashier at a bookstore. And I had managed to bumble my way into the computer industry and had gotten a couple of promotions, and things were going very well. Then I came home one day, and my wife said, I'm in love with somebody else, and I'm leaving.
Oh, man. In these 6 years and up until this moment, had you been very connected in the fellowship?
Oh, yeah. And
okay.
But part of the problem was my wife at that time, she and I used to use together. So we were in recovery together, and the guy that she left me for was also in recovery. And that was probably the most difficult period of my life, maybe even more so than any of the drug-addicted periods, only because I felt it all.
Right.
So I had a little bit more problem with AA at that point because I felt like, it's silly, it's childish, but I felt like this shouldn't be allowed to happen. And and what happened there was that didn't make me drink again, but it set the stage for me drinking again. And what I mean by that is when I came into AA, I've always wrestled with the higher power thing. I was never a believer in God, but I was so desperate that I just forced myself to believe this thing. I believe in this, because I felt like I had to. But when this thing happened with my wife, I realized that I did not have a spirituality that was strong enough, that was really mine, that I understood and made deep sense to me to support me through a life crisis.
Right.
And so the long and short of it is I stayed sober for a while after that, but I started drifting. I started drifting because recovery didn't make sense to me anymore in the same way. I would go to meetings, but I just wouldn't feel the connect. I mean, I just started to drift. And I got then very into other addictive behaviors started to pick up a little bit. I was very promiscuous. That became sort of an addiction. I was just chasing that all the time. I picked up smoking cigarettes. I had never smoked. Even through being an alcoholic and a heroin addict, I'd never smoked. And now here I am in my 30s picking up smoking like it's crazy. So the writing was all on the wall there. And I remember that I started contemplating, well, maybe I'm not an addict. Maybe I'm not an alcoholic, right? Like I was so young then, right? This is the thinking that's going on in my mind. I was so young then. I mean, I was 22 and 21 and so I'm a lot older now, and I didn't make any good decisions in those days. But look at my life now. Like, I'm a good dad. I've got a good job. I go to work every day. I exercise. I eat well. Like, I make all these good choices. So I was young. I've learned so much now. I've been through therapy. I'm a different person. And eventually, so I started thinking, well, maybe I can drink. And then I found out that my brother, who had been in recovery with me, he came in after me, but found out that he had been drinking for 6 or 8 months, and he said it was going great. It was fine. Uh-oh. And that was kind of the final straw for me, right? Because I was like, well, because that's the other thing we think about genetics, right? I was like, well, so I guess I'm not. And so I made a conscious decision. I'm going to drink. I can do this. And so I had a drink, and nothing happened. You go to meetings and you hear people say, I used to say it all the time, if I take a drink, the next thing you know, I'll be out on Martin Luther King Boulevard buying drugs on the corner again in 2 hours. Like I made it out to be this thing that would be this immediate disaster if I took a drink. And I took a drink, I had a beer, and that was it. And I went back and I went to bed. I was with a woman at that time. We were staying at a hotel, had a drink down at the bar, went back to bed. No issue. And so I wake up going, maybe this isn't that big a deal. And maybe the next night I have 2. But I'm talking to you on a recovery show, so it's clear this experiment did not end well.
I'm waiting.
Yeah, exactly. Sounds
I know
good.
it's coming.
So it progressed from there, and I never went back to using heroin. I drank and I smoked pot all the time, but it just progressed. It became more and more a part of my life, more and more, until it was a daily thing again that I did every day, drinking every day, nearly to a blackout, if not a blackout every night, smoking pot all day or taking Valium to come down in the morning so I'm not hungover or all that stuff. And so now I'm starting to have that, oh, shit, this isn't working, this isn't good. And so I decided that I was going to try moderation management. It's an actual program out there called Moderation Management because I did not want to come back to AA desperately.
I was about to say, I was listening to your story, just spending 6 years in recovery and knowing all the benefits of it and just fighting it so badly. I'm sitting here just like almost gritting my teeth going, come on, man. It's so much easier if you just go back to recovery.
Oh, yeah. Actually, it was more like 8 years of recovery. And I mean, in that time, I had sponsored 50 people. I mean, I was so active, so in it. I didn't want to go back. And the reason I didn't want to go back was not because I don't like you folks. It was that AA means abstinence. And I did not want abstinence. I did not want to give up what had yet again become what to me seemed like my best friend, my favorite thing in the world. And I think the truth is, even to this day, with the exception of my son, I don't think I've ever loved anything as much as I loved getting high.
Yeah.
That's an unfortunate statement, but
it's
probably
true.
But a true one.
Absolutely.
And so when you're in the grip of that, I want to do anything I could to avoid having to give that up. And so I thought, you know what? if I can moderate, then I don't have to go back. And so I tried moderation management, and I'm so glad I did. Moderation management calls for you to stay sober for 30 days first. So I gritted my teeth through that and did it. I mean, it was awful, and I did it, though. And then after 30 days, you're supposed to basically control your drinking based on your weight. There's a certain amount you're supposed to be able to drink every day. And then you report into these online forums and you do all these workbooks. And I mean, I really was serious about this.
Seriously, man. I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of work.
Well, it is a lot of work. But in my mind at that point, it was like, if I do this, then I get to keep drinking, right? I get to keep drinking.
I got it.
So I'm trying really hard, and it's a disaster, right?
I'm sorry. I'm just picturing all the chaos going on in your life and in your head in that moment.
Oh, it's terrible. Right away, I'm cheating. I'm like, well, I might be X weight today, but I used to be sort of like that weight. So I'm padding myself an extra drink, and then I'm pouring big drinks and all the games we play.
Mm-hmm.
My overriding memory of that time is standing by the kitchen sink, and it's, I don't know, called 11:30 at night. I've already had more than I should to drink, probably. Some nights I manage to stay to the right amount, but I've probably had more than I should. I'm going to bed. I got to get up at 6:30, and I'm standing there at the kitchen sink, the bottle's right there by me, and I'm in this just agonizing decision. Should I have another one? No, that's ridiculous. You're only supposed to have two, but I should. This like back and forth in my head. There's no plausible reason that I need another drink right that moment, but right before I'm going to go to bed. And yet, I can't walk away. And some nights I'd win that battle, and some nights I would lose that battle. But what I realized, there's that line in the book that says we were unable to control and enjoy our drinking. And what I realized in that moment was I could maybe, with all the effort in the world I had, control my drinking a little bit, but I would not enjoy it. It was miserable. Or I could just completely let go of control and just drink all I want. And then I could kind of enjoy that. But there was no way the two of those were going to happen together in my life.
Right.
I was never going to be able to keep it in any kind of control and enjoy it. And so eventually that effort got hard and I just gave up on it, right? Went from sort of paying attention to moderation management to just forget it and kind of pedal back to the metal kind of thing. And so I eventually ended up getting sober, and there was no apocalyptic moment that caused it, really. I mean, my wife, I think, was kind of getting tired of my drinking and was, complaining about it. But I mean, it wasn't really that big of a deal. I had just gotten a promotion. I was making more money than I ever had. I had, a nicer house, nicer cars, all that stuff than I'd ever had in my life.
Wait, did you remarry?
Oh, yes, I did. I'm sorry. Yes, I did.
Okay. There was a little... So in the interim of all this, you got remarried.
I did. Yep.
Ah, okay. All right.
Yeah, I did.
Anyway, so you got remarried, and now she wasn't in recovery.
She was a drinker.
Okay.
She was a drinker. And so, again, nothing really happens, but I'm trying so hard to keep all this together, and it's just not going great because I'm either drunk or I'm stoned or I'm on Ativan or Valium or something so I can be not hungover enough to go to work. And I'm trying to keep this demanding job at a startup company. And things are just kind of a mess. But I'm doing the classic, I'm surrounding myself with people who are far worse than me. So I think. I'm surrounding myself with people that don't have jobs at all or can't keep a job. And so I can go, well, you know what? Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm not doing great. But look, I mean, I've got this really high-level job. I've still got it, and I got a promotion. I could say that I was okay, comparison to those other people. But another night like any other, I've been on like a 3-day binge where I just am drinking around the clock. And I go to one of my best friend's houses, and we go out to a bar. So this is my last drink. Oh, actually, it's not, but it's close to. It's close to it. And I go out to the bar, and I'm just doing all my classic drunk things. Like I pass out at the bar, and then I wake up 20 minutes later and grab a shot, and I'm ready to go. And I'm getting on stage. It's a karaoke place, and I keep getting on stage with other people singing karaoke. Nobody wants me up there, but I just keep getting up there, right? And so I don't have much recollection of this, by the way. Went back to my friend's house, passed out. And in the morning, I woke up about 9 a.m. and completely freaked out. And the reason I freaked out is that I was the one that got my son up and off to school every day. And I did not go home. Now, he got up and got to school because my wife was there, and she got him up and she took him. It was fine. But in that moment, I had that that was the first time I felt like I had completely abdicated my duties in regards to my son. Now, was I a great parent because I was drinking? Probably not in a lot of ways. I would drink and pick him up from soccer practice, right? So, I mean, terrible things. I'd never done something like not get him to school or not be there when he expected me to be there or any of that kind of stuff. And so this was the first time of that. And that really freaked me out. And I was really, really sick. I had been drinking for like 4 days straight. I was just a mess, shaking. And my wife was pissed off. And my friend was a little bit irritated with me because I had been such a jackass the night before.
You were that guy.
Yeah, I was that guy, which is rare for me. That's not the normal drinker that I am, but whatever. So that was enough that I just said, okay, I'll go to AA today.
Wow.
Believe me, I did not want to go. And so I went, and I hated it. I did not have that like, oh, it's good to be back feeling. But for whatever reason, I was like, all right, I'm going to make this happen. And so I went to AA like every day for about 2 weeks. I'm just gritting my teeth through it, and I want to drink. And I'm feeling like I'm kind of being forced into this. And so after about 2 weeks, we go to my parents' house in Pittsburgh, and she goes out for the night with her friends. And I find myself in the upstairs bathroom, sneaking beers up to the upstairs bathroom and drinking them. And then we come home the next day, and I get a bottle of whiskey out. And I go from sober to completely fucked up to throwing up to passed out in about 30 minutes.
Oh.
I mean, I can't get the whiskey down my throat fast enough.
Wow.
Really sick, just, throwing up. I mean, just a mess. And I woke up from that and I went, okay, I think I'm done. That moment when I got up, I felt like I was the one that said I'm done instead of feeling sort of pushed into it by external things. And it was only 2 weeks after I had started. But I think I, in that moment, went, you know what? This is kind of played out. Like the ratio of pain to pleasure is way off at this point. And that's what has to happen, I think. I think we have to hit a point where we go, holy mackerel, this is a very different, the pain I'm getting out of this far outweighs the pleasure. And so I went back to AA. And I have to say, though, that, and I've had this experience talking to a lot of people, coming back is really hard. I don't know what it is. I don't know what causes it. The first time when I got sober, the desire to use and drink left me pretty quickly. It did not go away this time around for quite some time. Now, I recognized it was a bad idea, but I just wanted to drink all the time. And I think the other thing that was hard about what I was doing was I didn't hit the kind of bottom that I hit when I was 24. Living in the back of a van. I mean, on the outside, stuff was still there. I still had other choices. I could have kept doing it. But I kept saying to myself, do I really have to take this elevator to the bottom floor to get off? Do I really have to do that? Do I have to wait till I'm in a car accident with my son? How bad does this have to get? And that's a little bit of an intellectual exercise. Because when you've completely had your ass kicked, you feel it. And you're like, that's it. And for me, I felt it a little bit, but there was still some resistance there because I hadn't gone to maybe the bottom. So I had to keep reminding myself, like, this was low enough for me. But I just, like I said, I wanted to drink. I mean, I think I wanted to drink for 6 months, just a lot. And that is an awful, awful feeling. And I stay sober today a lot on simply, I never want to get sober again. I can't do it again. There's something about coming back. I really don't know what it is. Maybe the first time you're getting sober, you see so much hope. You see this life that you can't imagine. And so you're carried along. And for me coming back, I'm like, well, I know what this is like. I've done this. And yes, is it better than what I've got now? Yes, but it's still life, right? And so I wrestled with staying sober, but I did it. I did what we do. I went to meetings. I went to a lot of meetings. I got a sponsor. I just did it. It was very different for me the second time around. The first time around, there was a very social aspect to it. I had a lot of friends. I spent a lot of time with people. Now I'm older. I've got a kid. I've got a family. I've got a very demanding job. And so I went to meetings and I'd stick around a little while afterwards, but it didn't have all the social element to it. But I was just very focused on, all right, stay sober, enough to stay sober. And eventually the desire to drink left me, at least most of the time. And I just kind of kept working my way through recovery at that point. And then I founded my own solar energy company a little while after that and threw a lot of energy into that. And then that kind of came to its conclusion, and I started the podcast. And that kind of takes us to today. And I think the one thing that has been important about my recovery, and I share this for the people who wrestle with the same thing, was that I never got to the point again where I believed in God in the traditional sense. I never got to the point, and I still don't, where my higher power is some sort of being out there who gives me assistance in life. So I guess I'm an atheist. But I have found a way to make the steps work incredibly well for me. I found for myself a spirituality that works. And so I talk about it not because I think it's right, better than anybody else's or anything like that. I just know there's a lot of people who get hung up on this thing, this God issue in recovery. And so I talk about it because I just think it's so important that if you feel that way, you can still find recovery. And so what I had to do was go, okay, well, I believe I'm powerless over alcohol. And so what is a higher power? What is this God I'm turning my God as I understand him? What am I doing here? Because I recognize by myself, I'm not enough to do this.
Right.
And if I don't believe that there's some being out there that's doing it for me, then how does this happen? And so what I came to believe in was, a couple things. I certainly came to believe in the power of the group.
Yes.
That the group as a whole, that AA as a whole has an ability to help me to get sober. I don't have to do it alone, and that's absolutely critical. And then the other was that I turned my will and my life over to a set of spiritual principles that I believe work. And so there's no magic behind them, but being less selfish works. Being kinder works. Telling the truth works. And so what I did was I turned my will and my life over to trying to live by these principles. So between the power of the group, other people, and these spiritual principles that I believe to be true, that's what I turned my will and my life over to. And for me, that is a spirituality that works. Because what I've gotten to is I don't any longer, I think when the first time I was in recovery, I thought if I do good things, if I sponsor a lot of people, if I'm really active in AA, then I will get good things in life and only good things in life, which is a child's spirituality, right? It's a child's idea, but that's kind of what I had. And now I don't have any illusion that any of these things that I do are going to protect me from the heartbreaks and the heartaches of life. I don't think there is any protection from those. Those things are going to come. What I now believe is that the power of other people, the power of spiritual principles will enable me to get through anything that comes. That's what my faith is. My faith is that I can stay sober and get through anything that life throws my way. Not that I'll be protected from those things, but that I have the power with those principles and people that I can get through those things. And so that's the spirituality that I found works for me. So I just thought it's an important part of my story that I wanted to add because, as I said before, the first time when something really bad happened to me, my spirituality didn't work. I didn't have one that sustained me. So when the hard times came, I didn't have anything to fall back on. And I feel a lot more this time like, okay, I think there's some line in the book of spirituality that works. That's what I've got. I've got one that works for me.
And that's your story.
I think that's my story. Now there's the show, which is kind of the love of my life. Because I get to talk about these kind of things, I get to practice the principles of recovery. One of the things I love about the show is it's not a recovery show, as I said. And so there's thousands and thousands of people who are listening who have no exposure to recovery. But what I realized is that I'm often giving out so much of what I learned in recovery. I say on the show a lot, we talk a lot about action. And I heard in AA, it was the first time I heard you can't think your way into right action. You have to act your way into right thinking.
Yes.
That's a powerful, powerful lesson that a lot of people in the world never have heard. But I'm able to bring that, I'm able to bring some of these principles and give them to a broader audience, which is satisfying to me, as well as continuing to help. A lot of people listening to the show are recovering because those themes are there a lot. So that's my story.
Excellent, wonderful, amazing. There's so many points in your story, and especially this last part about your own relationship with a higher power and what you choose to call your higher power, because it's so true. I've been in recovery for 12 years now, And so you get an opportunity to develop this network of people all around you, and they all have a different idea of what God is to them. And there's some that are atheists that absolutely have a higher power that is more about what you're talking about here, which is more of the power of the rooms and developing these spiritual principles that you live by. And so absolutely wonderful and amazing story. Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing that with us. Just real quick, how did then the podcast come to be? Like, what was that moment where you're like, I have this idea and I want to run with it?
Well, it came about in a weird way. I had the solar energy company I told you about, and I decided I wanted to create an online course for people on how to develop large solar energy projects. So I started getting into online marketing a lot. Like, okay, if I do that, then I've got to market it, I got to sell it. And that got me introduced to podcasts. And I started listening to podcasts. And I found some, like, I didn't just listen to like business podcasts. I found some that I was like, wow, this is really helpful to me to get this sort of positive message. And then I eventually gave up on the idea of creating the online course for solar energy. I didn't want to do it anymore. But I still kind of had podcasting or, online marketing on the brain. And then one day it just, I don't know where it came from. I just got the idea, wow, I could use that parable as a way to interview people about, and I just instantly was like, I think that's a great idea. And I called my best friend, Chris, because he's sort of an audio engineer. And I said, hey, let's meet for dinner tonight. We met for dinner and I said, here's this idea I got, blah, blah, blah. And we just kind of started on it the next day.
I love it. And so how long has the podcast been going now?
We are a little over a year and a half.
Wow, it's amazing because I've looked, you've got to have over 500 reviews on there. So you've got a lot of positive feedback in this short amount of time.
Yeah, we have, I get emails and stuff that just kind of blow me away a little bit. I'm still getting used to this idea of how much some people really love this show. I keep hearing things like it changed my life, or I'm like, whoa, that's kind of...
It's heavy.
It's heavy, yep. But it's not that out of the order. I mean, that's what we do in AA, right? With people, we're always doing that sort of thing for each other. So
it's so rewarding.
But yeah,
it's so rewarding.
But so I love doing the show. I mean, it's an extension of recovery and it keeps me in fit spiritual condition for sure by focusing on these things. I'm focusing on spiritual principles all the time. How do you live a good life? What does that mean? And ultimately, that's what recovery is about. Once you get rid of the drugs and alcohol, how do I live a life in such a way that I'm content enough and I feel good enough and I'm strong enough that I don't need something to modify reality for me?
Absolutely.
And so it's about how do you live a good life? And that's the entire premise of our show. The tagline is, conversations about creating a life worth living. And so that's what we do. And so I'm deeply immersed in that every day. And that's a definite support to me being in recovery for sure.
I have to concur. I mean, there is so much positive reinforcement for my own life and my own recovery and my own commitment to the podcast is exactly what's happening with you. It's like I'm having these interviews every week with individuals and we're discussing recovery. We're talking about how their lives have changed and the positive aspects of their lives. And also I'm getting these emails like you are. And so it's heavy. When I say heavy, it means like I feel like all of a sudden it's not just this hobby anymore. And it's more like, wow, there's people out there that are actually tuning in every week, listening to this show, waiting for this message. And it kind of creates a little bit of pressure, not,
Yep. No, I mean, I hear what you're saying. And I wish early in recovery for me, my first time around, that there had been podcasts. I was old enough that, you used to have cassette tapes of leads floating around. You'd get a bunch of cassette tapes of people's leads. So I think stuff like what you're doing is so useful and helpful to people because you can get a good shot of recovery wherever you are.
Yes, and that's what we get. So, Eric, listen, let's start closing up the show. If we wanted to, we could go on for hours, because it's really good stuff and I love it. But what I like to do is at the end of the show is I like to ask a few questions for the newcomer. So okay. I'm going to ask you a few questions about your early recovery, and you're going to respond with inspiring, insightful answers you can share with our newcomers. Are you ready?
I think so. Let's hope it's inspiring.
It's been so far.
All right.
Now, the first question we've kind of already covered, And it's what was keeping you from getting clean or staying clean when you first got introduced to recovery?
I think still some degree of resistance to getting clean. I finally realized, like, I need the meetings, I need the social support, I need the steps, I need the spirituality, I need all of it. And previous times I had taken bits and pieces of that. So when I finally embraced it and said, all right, I'm going to take all of it, it worked.
Perfect. And that is funny because at one point you were like, I don't know what it was. I don't know why it was so difficult coming back in the second time. And all I kept thinking to myself is it's a giant ego that we have that is just constantly just screaming at us that we're not good enough or that we don't need this. And more importantly, there's that feeling of perfectionism, at least for me. I know when I don't do something right the first time, well, moving on to the next thing. And I think recovery is no different. You know, you had this stretch going where you were doing well, and 8 years is a long time. So coming off that stretch is like such an ego-deflating issue. I can totally relate to you when you said, man, I don't want to start over again, or I don't want to
have to get sober again.
Yes. It's a great, like, I love it. I don't want to get sober again.
And I think for the newcomer, that's such an important point because being sober is a great thing. You know, a life in recovery is a great thing. Getting there, that part of getting sober is often just hell. And so if you're new, you're probably in that spot for a little while. And if you can just hang on, I think the other thing that keeps people from getting clean, it did me, is I'd get clean for 4 or 5 days and I would feel so awful. I'd be like, this is what sobriety is? Forget it. And no, that is not what sobriety is. Sobriety is a whole different ballgame. That's the getting sober process, and that is no fun. But if you can stick through that, the good stuff is right on the other side.
Absolutely perfect. That's beautiful, man. So next question. At what point did you have a spiritual awakening, that aha moment in recovery when you accepted that you were powerless over drugs and alcohol, but for the first time had developed that hope that you could recover?
I think it was probably somewhere in that 28-day treatment program when I said I would be willing to go to the 6-month treatment program. I think somewhere in there I had that moment of, all right, I give up. You guys say this is what I should do. I'll do it because I want to get sober and I believe I can and I believe it's worth doing. So it was somewhere in there, I think, was the first big aha moment.
Excellent. Next question. Do you have a favorite book that you would recommend to a newcomer that you read in early recovery?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I certainly read all the AA-approved stuff. I got a lot out of that. There's a book called The Spirituality of Imperfection.
Yes.
Which is a great book by Ernest Kurtz. You know, he talks a lot about AA in there. So that book was really helpful to me in my recovery to frame things in a slightly different way. But I have always been, since I got into recovery, I mean, I've just read a lot of spiritual stuff. I lean much more Buddhist, so I read a lot of that kind of stuff. But I find reading spiritual things or inspiring things a really powerful add-on to my recovery. I think, Bill Wilson said at one point that AA is kind of like spiritual kindergarten. We need to grow outside of that in our own spiritual lives. So I read a lot, but that's a great book to start with.
Perfect. You know, what's funny is my sponsor gave me that book years ago. And I still have not read it because I'm not a reader. And so I usually listen to everything on Audible. Yeah. Right? And I don't think it's on Audible because I think I would have already found it. But I'm glad you brought it up.
It's not on Audible. And that's funny because I keep a list of like things I someday want to do. And that one and one other AA-related book that's not AA, I can't remember which one it is exactly, on my list is someday to get those made into audio programs.
No kidding.
No kidding, because I think some of that stuff is so powerful. I just do think that audio provides something that's really special for people.
It does.
Particularly if they don't like to read. I mean, I love to read, but I get that a lot of people don't. And I love audiobooks too.
Normally, most of us have a commute to work. So you're going to be in the car for half an hour to an hour, which was where our popularity comes in. And that's where I've digested so much of the books that I've heard recommended. I go to Audible. If it's on there, I download it and I'm off to work. I love those things. So yeah, man, that's funny. If you get it transcribed on Audible, I want it. You got to hook me up.
I will. Trust me, it's nowhere in the next couple year plan, but someday maybe.
All right. So, Eric, what is the best suggestion you have ever received?
Whoa. Best suggestion I've ever received. I think the best suggestion I've ever received is kind of what we get in the Serenity Prayer, which is look for what you can change. And if you can't change it, find a way to let it go.
I love it.
I think that's the biggest one for me.
Beautiful. And if you could give a newcomer only one suggestion, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, but keep coming back. I mean, we say that for a reason, because if you do, you can get sober, whoever you are, you can, and it is worth the effort. So just keep coming back. I know it sucks in the beginning sometimes, but that's not the way it will remain. So keep doing it, even when you fail.
It's one of the most popular suggestions. When I ask that question, keep coming back is one of the top suggestions because it's so true. Most of us, in your story, it's all riddled with that. If you would have just kept coming back, you bring the body, the mind follows. We've heard that before. So if you just keep coming back, eventually it will marinate.
Yeah, I mean, all the other suggestions will come to be if you just keep showing up. And I mean, it's that way for a lot of people. I mean, I just know so many people who it didn't take the first time, so they come back. It didn't take the second time, so they come back. But sooner or later, for most of us, it takes.
I love it. Eric, great suggestions. We have now reached the end of our show. Thanks for joining us. And as we say here in Costa Rica, pura vida.
Pura vida.
Thank you for joining us on the Share Recovery Podcast. To check out the show notes page on this interview or to thank our guests for sharing their story, go to www.thesharepodcast.com. While you're on the website, don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter to stay up to date on the latest news, podcasts, and interviews. Want to be one of our guests and share your story? Then go to our website and click on the Share Your Story button. We share our inspiring recovery stories every Tuesday, so subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher Radio to get your free weekly download. We'll see you then. The opinions shared on this show reflect those of the individual speaker and not of any 12-Step Fellowship as a whole. And though we discuss 12-Step recovery and the impact it had in our lives, we do not promote or endorse any 12-Step Anonymous program.